sedating bees with deep cold, keeping them in a hibernation state for more than 2 weeks, shipping them by sea, and then releasing them right into the center of the Sahara where you would never imagine anything could survive.
You have never once worried about the bees, and that is exactly the problem, because the silent collapse already underway will reach your kitchen long before it ever reaches the news. The small creatures quietly holding our entire food supply together are dying at a speed never seen before. And as that quiet terror spread, someone made a claim so desperate and so bizarre that the whole world stopped scrolling to stare. The year the bees did not come back. During the long winter that stretched from 2024 into the spring of 2025, beekeepers across the United States walked out to their hives expecting that familiar low hum of life, and what they met instead was silence. Boxes that should have been crowded with tens of thousands of warm bodies sat cold and motionless, and when they pried the lids open, there was almost nothing left inside worth saving. This was not the ordinary seasonal dip that every beekeeper learns to accept as part of the trade. When the national surveys came back, the people whose entire careers are spent tracking these numbers were shaken because commercial operations had lost on average around 62% of their colonies in a single stretch, and that figure now stands as the heaviest die-off ever recorded in the country. Every year, almost the entire population of managed honeybees in the United States is loaded onto trucks and driven, sometimes across thousands of miles, toward one place in California, because nearly 1.5 million acres of almond trees burst into bloom at once and demand pollination within a few short weeks. That one crop alone consumes close to 2.7 million colonies, which is very nearly every commercial hive the nation possesses, all converging on the same orchards during the same narrow window of days. So when the bees die at the rate they died that winter, there is no hidden reserve waiting quietly in the wings. The margin was already gone before the season even began. If you want to see what a world stripped of its pollinators truly looks like, you do not have to imagine anything, because it already exists. In parts of southwestern China, in the orchard country of Hanyuan County, the wild bees have essentially vanished, killed off across decades by heavy pesticide spraying and the slow erasure of the habitat they once depended on. The fruit trees still need pollinating, so the people now do the work with their own hands, one blossom at a time. They climb up through the branches, carrying little brushes tipped with chicken feathers, dabbing pollen onto flower after flower across entire orchards, performing slowly and at enormous cost the exact job that insects once did for free and did far better than we ever could. The bee ecologist Dave Goulson summed up the quiet horror of it when he pointed out that there are simply not enough human beings on the planet to ever pollinate all of our crops by hand. That is the real fear humming beneath all of this, the genuine emergency that had people across the world desperate for an answer. And it was into exactly that climate of rising panic that a story arrived, a claim so wild and so cinematic that it spread across the internet like fire, insisting that someone had finally discovered a radical answer for the dying bees in the single most lifeless place anywhere on Earth. How a bee beats the sun. The story went something like this, and there is a real chance you have already watched some version of it drift across your screen. Somewhere deep in the Sahara, in a place where the sand itself can climb to temperatures that would cook an egg in seconds, teams of researchers supposedly pried open container after container and released millions of honeybees that had been frozen nearly solid for weeks on end. The bees were turned loose into the harshest desert on the planet and then left entirely alone for a full year, and the claim insisted that this desperate gamble had somehow worked, that it might even become a blueprint for rescuing pollinators everywhere. To even begin judging whether you could throw bees into that kind of inferno and expect them to live, you first have to understand something very few people ever stop to consider, which is how a honeybee survives heat at all. And the truth is that a honeybee has no business thriving in a desert in the first place, Because these insects are not some ancient native of the dunes. They are relative newcomers to enormous stretches of this world. Honeybees were carried across the ocean to the shores of Virginia by European settlers back in the year 1622, and they spread so slowly afterwards that it took them more than 2 full centuries to reach the far western coast, with some native peoples reportedly calling them the white man's fly. They were never built for most deserts, and the true pollinators of dry country have always been the wild and solitary bees, the moths, the bats, and the beetles instead. So the question of how a honeybee could ever cling to life in a place like the Sahara is a serious one, and the answer happens to be one of the most quietly astonishing feats in the natural world. A honeybee colony is not really a loose crowd of separate little insects. It behaves far more like a single living body that controls its own internal temperature with a precision that would impress a trained engineer. Deep in the heart of the hive, the bees hold the area where their young are growing at a steady warmth of around 35 degrees Celsius, and they keep it locked there with remarkable stability, even while the world outside lurches from 13 degrees on a cold morning all the way up to 41 degrees in the punishing afternoon. When the temperature climbs and starts to threaten the vulnerable young, the workers do something that feels almost impossible. They line themselves up and beat their wings in unison to drive moving air through the chambers, and they spread tiny droplets of water across the comb so that evaporation can pull the temperature back down. They have, in the most literal sense, built a living air conditioning system out of nothing but their own bodies and a little water. And that is precisely why a colony can survive conditions that ought to kill it. But there is a hard ceiling on what even that brilliance can accomplish. Push the heat far enough. Once it climbs past about 45 degrees Celsius, and the bees begin to die no matter how furiously they fan. And the desert shoves itself far past that point. While the air above the sand might read a brutal 45 degrees, the surface of the sand beneath it can roar all the way up to 70 or even 80 degrees, with measured records climbing past 83 degrees in places like Port Sudan. No amount of frantic wing beating saves a colony that tries to work straight through the middle of a day like that, which leaves us with an obvious and nagging problem. The question of how anything alive manages to feed itself out there at all. And the answer turns out to be the very same answer the entire desert has been quietly relying on for millions of years. The real secret to surviving out there was never about being the strongest or the toughest thing on the sand. And what actually keeps a creature breathing in that furnace is something so simple and so counterintuitive that almost nobody would ever guess it on their first try. The shift we were never awake to watch. The animals that thrive in extreme desert heat do not fight it. They simply avoid it. The fennec fox, with its enormous ears, spends the hottest hours hidden deep inside cool underground burrows, panting rapidly to release excess heat. Only after darkness falls does it emerge to hunt and explore. Desert gazelles follow a similar strategy, reducing movement to almost nothing when the sun reaches its peak. The secret of desert survival is not strength or endurance. It is timing. It is knowing exactly when not to be exposed. What makes this possible is the desert's remarkable temperature swing. The moment the sun disappears, the bone-dry air releases heat almost as quickly as it absorbed it. In only a few hours, temperatures can drop by 20 degrees or more. That cooling creates a narrow window of survivable conditions between the fading heat and the deep darkness of night. It is during this brief period that much of desert life becomes active. That realization raises an unsettling question. What if scientists had been watching the wrong part of the day? For generations, researchers studied deserts mostly during daylight hours because that was when people worked comfortably. Cameras were set up in the morning and packed away by evening. Entire theories about desert ecosystems were built around the hours most convenient for humans, while much of the nighttime activity remained unseen. In 2020, researchers from University College London decided to look more closely at what happened after dark. Their experiment was simple. They captured moths at night and checked them for pollen. The results were surprising. Nearly half of more than 800 moths examined carried pollen from dozens of plant species, including many rarely visited by daytime pollinators. The network of plants connected by these nocturnal moths turned out to be larger and more complex than the daytime pollination network scientists had focused on for decades. Researcher Richard Walton described moths as an overlooked but vital backup system helping maintain plant diversity. His colleague Jan Axmacher noted that science had devoted enormous attention to bees while largely ignoring moths, despite moths representing far greater species diversity. Desert plants had been exploiting this nighttime system all along. Many species deliberately bloom after sunset, producing pale flowers that reflect moonlight and releasing strong fragrances only at night. Sacred datura, evening primrose, saguaro cactus, agave, and yucca all follow this strategy. They are essentially advertising to the insects and animals that emerge once temperatures become bearable. Studies on certain desert flowers have even shown that plants exposed only to nighttime pollinators can produce just as many seeds as those exposed only during the day. The night shift is not a backup plan. It is an equally important part of the ecosystem. Even more remarkable is the Saharan silver ant. This tiny insect ventures across scorching sand that would kill most animals. It survives by operating within a tiny margin below its lethal temperature limit and timing its activity to a few brief minutes during the hottest part of the day. By doing so, it avoids predators that are forced to remain hidden. Once again, survival depends on timing rather than brute strength. So, when scientists finally turned their attention to which bee colonies could survive relentless heat the longest, everyone expected the largest and strongest colonies to win. What they discovered instead was the exact opposite, and the reason quietly challenges everything we think strength is supposed to mean. The weakness that was secretly strength. The thing actually killing commercial bees on such a massive scale is not the heat itself. In many ways, the heat has been a distraction from the real threat. The true killer is a tiny parasite called the varroa mite. It attaches itself to bees, feeds on them, and spreads deadly viruses throughout entire colonies. One of the worst is deformed wing virus, which can turn a healthy hive into a silent graveyard. When researchers investigated the devastating bee losses during one particularly disastrous winter, they found collapsing colonies overwhelmed by these viruses. Even more alarming, they discovered that the mites carrying them had become resistant to the chemical treatments beekeepers had relied on for years. The defense we had carefully built was quietly failing, while the parasite simply evolved its way around it. Now place that fact beside an uncomfortable one. Certain wild African bee populations survive these same mites without any chemical treatment at all. They are not managed, protected, or heavily monitored, yet they continue to thrive where commercial colonies often collapse. The reason is simple. These wild bees possess natural behaviors that prevent mites from reproducing effectively inside their hives. The troubling part is that many of those survival traits are the very ones humans deliberately bred out of commercial bees. We wanted bees that produced more honey, stayed gentle, and lived in large, manageable colonies. In pursuit of greater efficiency and profit, we slowly removed many of the instincts that helped bees survive difficult conditions. Wild colonies tend to remain smaller. They swarm more frequently, abandoning unhealthy nests and relocating when necessary. They raise young faster and maintain behaviors that many commercial beekeepers view as inconvenient. We looked at these traits and labeled them inefficient. Then we engineered a bee optimized for production, compliance, and scale. In doing so, we may have removed the very qualities that allow a colony to endure hardship. And this lesson reaches far beyond bees. The thing designed to perform perfectly under ideal conditions is rarely the thing that survives when conditions become difficult. Systems built entirely around efficiency often lose their flexibility. Every spare margin is trimmed away. Every backup is removed. Every ounce of redundancy is treated as waste. Such systems appear impressive right up until something unexpected happens. Then they fail because they have nothing left in reserve. The most optimized solutions often look superior, and they genuinely are superior until the exact moment they are not. Ecologists see this pattern in nature as well. Models of pollination networks show that the most connected and heavily relied upon species can become dangerous points of failure. When one of these critical species disappears, its loss triggers a chain reaction that affects many others. The honeybee sits near the center of that network. Its collapse does not remain isolated. It spreads outward through the system, which brings us to perhaps the most dangerous instinct humans possess, one that often feels like wisdom and progress. The moment we find something successful, our first impulse is to make it bigger, faster, and more efficient. We scale it up, streamline it, and squeeze every possible bit of output from it. The southern edge of the Sahara is filled with expensive reminders of what happens when that instinct is taken too far. And what happened there reveals a lesson that may be even more important than anything we have learned from the bees. The help that made everything worse. There is a deeply human pattern in the way we respond to a struggling landscape, and it is remarkably difficult to resist. The moment we see the slightest sign of success, a patch of fresh green or a small improvement in the numbers, our instinct is to scale it up. More trees, bigger projects, faster timelines, grand plans stretching across entire continents. It feels like progress. It feels responsible. Yet, along the southern edge of the Sahara, that exact impulse has produced failure after failure because the land never truly wanted what we kept trying to give it. The Great Green Wall, an ambitious effort to plant a living barrier of trees across Africa to slow desert expansion, became a powerful lesson in this reality. In places like Senegal, less than half the planted trees survived, while local herders often found their grazing lands disrupted. After years of work and enormous investment, only a small fraction of the intended restoration goals had been achieved. Part of the problem came from the approach itself. Many projects relied on fast-growing tree species chosen for quick results, rather than long-term suitability. These thirsty trees consumed valuable groundwater and increased soil salinity, gradually harming native plants that had survived in those conditions for centuries. Land restoration expert Chris Reege highlighted the harsh numbers behind these efforts, noting that only about 20% of trees planted across the Sahara since the 1980s survived. For the resources invested, the return was surprisingly small. What works is far less dramatic. Across dry regions, communities have restored degraded land using simple half-moon-shaped basins dug into the soil. These shallow depressions capture rainwater and allow it to soak into the ground instead of running off. Seeds gain the moisture they need to germinate, and vegetation gradually returns. Agricultural researchers have found that these small earthworks can increase water infiltration by up to 70%, while reducing soil erosion by more than half. There is no grand engineering behind the method, no fleets of machines, no massive construction projects, just a patient willingness to work with the land instead of forcing it to become something else. Beneath many failed environmental projects lies a realization that is difficult for us to accept. The desert was never truly broken. It was not a mistake waiting to be corrected or an empty space that needed transforming into something greener. It was already doing exactly what a desert is meant to do, supporting life under conditions that most ecosystems could never endure. Our repeated attempts to fix it often reveal more about our preferences than about the needs of the land itself. We tend to assume that greener automatically means better because it matches the landscapes we find familiar and beautiful. But the desert never needed rescuing. It simply needed the freedom to continue performing the difficult work it had mastered long before we arrived. And that is where the story becomes even more surprising. Because the landscape we so often dismiss as barren and worthless is quietly sustaining another ecosystem thousands of miles away. The desert we keep trying to change is helping keep a completely different world alive on the far side of an ocean, linking two places that could not appear more different at first glance. The dead place that feeds the living world. This is the single fact that, the first time I genuinely understood it, made me physically sit back from my screen, because it completely reframes the entire story we have been telling ourselves about land that looks dead. Every single year, hundreds of millions of tons of fine dust lift up off the surface of the Sahara, get caught and carried by the wind, and travel all the way west across the Atlantic Ocean. Some of it dusts down over the Caribbean along the way, but an enormous amount of it just keeps right on going until it reaches South America and finally settles across the Amazon rainforest, the single most alive and most biologically crowded place anywhere on the planet. Satellites operated by NASA actually measured this strange flow carefully over a span of several years, and the numbers they came back with are almost too neat to believe. Roughly 182 million tons of dust leave the African continent every year, and very nearly 28 million tons of it rains down directly over the Amazon basin. Now, here is exactly why all of that drifting dust matters so deeply, and why this is so much more than just a strange piece of weather trivia. That Saharan dust quietly carries phosphorus, which is one of the most essential nutrients any tree needs in order to grow. And the rainforest happens to be constantly losing its own phosphorus as the heavy tropical rains and the seasonal floods steadily wash it straight out of the soil. The dust arriving faithfully from across the ocean delivers an estimated 22,000 tons of phosphorus every year, which scientists discovered is almost exactly the amount the rainforest loses to all of that rain and flooding. In other words, the most lifeless desert anywhere on Earth is patiently fertilizing the most fertile forest anywhere on Earth, replacing the precious nutrients the rainforest bleeds away, quietly keeping the lungs of our entire planet breathing from thousands of miles away. The atmospheric scientist who led that remarkable work, a researcher named Hongbin Yu, described dust as a genuinely essential component of the whole Earth system, something woven directly into the way the entire planet manages to function. And then there is the one final detail that lifts this whole thing up out of dry science and into something closer to poetry. The vast majority of that nourishing dust does not actually come up off the Sahara at random from just anywhere. It comes overwhelmingly from one single specific place, a low depression in the land called the Baudelaire. And that spot is nothing less than the dried-out skeleton of an ancient lake. Many thousands of years ago, that exact location was part of an enormous body of fresh water, a lake once larger than all of North America's Great Lakes combined together, teeming with microscopic living things. When the water finally vanished, what it left behind was a vast and silent bed of fossilized remains, the tiny silica skeletons of countless dead microscopic organisms called diatoms. And it is precisely those ancient dead bodies that turn out to be so astonishingly rich in the very phosphorus the Amazon craves. The wind funnels itself through a gap between the mountains and lifts roughly 700,000 tons of this fossil dust up into the open sky on a single winter day. That same thread runs straight through every single part of this story. And once you finally see it, you cannot ever unsee it again. Which means it is time, at long last, to go all the way back to the strange claim that started this entire journey in the first place, the millions of frozen bees scattered across the burning Sahara, and to finally face the truth about what really happened out there. The story that was too strange to be true. So I went looking, properly and seriously, for the actual study sitting behind that viral story, because a claim that bold should be the easiest thing in the world to trace right back to its source, back to a real university, a named research team, a published scientific paper, or even just a single living scientist willing to put their name beside the work. What I found instead, after a great deal of searching, was nothing solid at all. There is no documented experiment anywhere that matches this story. No institution that ever ran it. No researcher who ever signed their name to it. No coordinates. No recorded data. No trace of it in the scientific record. The entire tale exists only on a ring of automated content channels and endlessly recycled blogs that pass the same fiction back and forth between themselves until it slowly begins to feel true through nothing more than sheer repetition. So I am going to be honest with you in a way not one of those channels ever bothered to be, which is that the millions of frozen bees released into the Sahara, exactly as that dramatic tale is told, never actually happened. And yet, I genuinely could not bring myself to let it go, because as I carefully pulled the whole story apart piece by piece, I slowly realized that almost every single fragment of it had been quietly stolen from something completely real, and that the real pieces were somehow far stranger and far more frightening than the comforting fiction had ever managed to be. The people who built this myth did not invent the whole thing out of thin air. They scavenged it directly from genuine science about heat and about survival, from the very real and very terrifying speed at which our pollinators are actually failing all around us. And then they stitched all of those true fragments together into a neat little fairy tale with a happy ending carefully stapled onto the end of it. The trouble is that the real truth has no happy ending stapled onto it anywhere. And that, more than anything else, is exactly why the truth matters so much more than the story ever could. Think for a moment about why a fiction like this spreads so far and so impossibly fast in the first place. It spreads precisely because the fear sitting underneath it is so painfully real. When something we all quietly depend on starts visibly dying, and the experts who study it for a living begin to sound this frightened, the human mind goes desperately searching for a single bold and dramatic solution, some clean and heroic stroke that might somehow turn the entire grim situation around overnight. A story about scientists boldly throwing frozen bees into the desert and somehow saving the day gives us exactly that comforting feeling, that warm reassurance that someone clever is out there fixing this whole mess on our behalf. The real science quietly refuses to offer us that easy comfort, and it asks something genuinely harder of us instead. It asks us to actually pay attention to the small, unglamorous, invisible things already holding our world together, long before they finally fall silent for good. Because that, in the end, is the real and lasting lesson the bees were patiently trying to teach us all along, hiding in plain sight underneath a story that was never even true. The small, wild colonies quietly survive while the big, optimized, impressive ones collapse and die. The overlooked moths faithfully pollinate in the pitch dark, while the entire world lies fast asleep. The humble little half-moon basins gently reviving land that grand and expensive projects could never manage to save. The dead and silent desert patiently feeding the wildly living forest from thousands of miles away. None of it is loud, none of it is dramatic, none of it ever photographs well enough to go viral, and yet every quiet piece of it is holding something genuinely essential together. We have such a deep and stubborn habit of measuring the worth of a place, or a creature, or an entire system, purely by how closely it happens to resemble something we already admire. And the brutal truth is that the things doing the very most for us are so often the exact things we have already written off as worthless, doing their quiet and irreplaceable work in the dark, in the very places where we were simply never awake enough to watch. So tell me honestly down in the comments, before today, did you ever once imagine that a dead and silent desert could be the very thing keeping a living rainforest alive? Share the part of this that rearranged the way you see the natural world, because I would genuinely love to think it through together with you.